Welcome and aloha. I am Mark Shklov, the host of ThinkTech Hawaii's Law Across the Sea program. Today we'll go across the sea to talk with Carole Petersen about Hong Kong and the newly enacted national security law. Carole lived and taught law in Hong Kong for 17 years, from 1989 to 2006. She is now a professor of international law at the William S. Richardson School of Law at the University of Hawaii. On July 1st, Carole testified before the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Foreign Affairs concerning the national security law that's now in effect in Hong Kong. Carole, welcome. It's good to see you. It has been about a month since the People's Republic of China's National People's Congress passed the national security law in order to curb what was alleged to be, as I understand it, subversive activities in Hong Kong. And I'd like you to tell us, what have we learned so far about this new law and its reception in Hong Kong and the rest of the world?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. Yes, on June 30th, the NPC Standing Committee adopted this new law in pursuit of the decision adopted by the NPC itself. And the law was not seen by the Hong Kong public before it went into force. It was adopted on June 30th, immediately added to Annex 3 of the Hong Kong Basic Law, and it went into force at 11 p.m. on June 30th. So there are, in my opinion, three main areas of concern. The first is that this law effectively destroys, or at least certainly greatly weakens, the legal firewall that used to separate the Hong Kong and mainland Chinese legal systems. And by this, I mean that this law empowers security personnel from mainland China to operate openly in Hong Kong for the first time. We knew that in the past, occasionally, security personnel came in an undercover basis and operated clandestinely in Hong Kong. For example, we believe they kidnapped a bookseller from Hong Kong, but they didn't have authority to do that or to do anything in Hong Kong for that matter. Now they have full authority to operate in Hong Kong. They've already set up an office for safeguarding national security. It's housed in a hotel that looks right down in Victoria Park, which was the place where many of the pro-democracy protests started, and the place where Hong Kong people hold the annual vigil in memory of the victims of June 4th. So now we have these security personnel operating openly in Hong Kong, and most importantly, according to Article 60 of the law, they are not subject to the jurisdiction of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region, which means that they can, I believe, operate with impunity, at least as far as Hong Kong law goes. They cannot be searched, for example, by Hong Kong police. So I'm very concerned about the weakening of that firewall. And I think it's because of that, and also Article 55, which allows mainland China to assert jurisdiction over any case if they wish to do so, and take a person to the mainland for trial. For that reason, that firewall is now greatly damaged. And I think foreign governments are correctly reassessing whether they should have an extradition agreement with Hong Kong, for example, because in the past, a foreign government could extradite a fugitive to Hong Kong and know that that person would have a right to fair trial in the Hong Kong legal system. Now we don't know. It's possible that they might be taken to mainland China for trial, and at that point, mainland Chinese criminal procedure applies. So that's the first big concern I have. The second concern is that the law creates new criminal offenses in Hong Kong, such as the offense of secession and the offense of subversion and the offense of collusion with a foreign power. And these offenses are defined in very broad terms. We can talk more if you have specific questions about the definition, but they're defined so broadly and so vaguely that I think if they're interpreted too broadly, they will definitely conflict with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is supposed to apply to Hong Kong under the Sino-British Joint Declaration and on under Hong Kong's regional constitution, the Basic Law. So some of the ambiguities in these offenses might be dealt with through judicial interpretation, because the Hong Kong courts, we believe, will be primarily the courts where people are tried if they are accused of violating these offenses. And if the Hong Kong courts have the power to do so, I think the Hong Kong judges will do their best to interpret vague language so as to comply with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. But here's the stickler. The law states that the power of interpretation of this law is vested in the National People's Congress Standing Committee. That is also true for the Hong Kong Basic Law. Now, with respect to the Hong Kong Basic Law, a compromise was reached under Article 158 of the Basic Law, whereby Hong Kong judges interpret the Basic Law in the course of adjudicating cases. That's the common law approach, which is what Hong Kong is supposed to have, a common law legal system. However, if the NPC Standing Committee really doesn't like an interpretation that a Hong Kong judge gives, it can always issue a contravening interpretation, and thereafter the Hong Kong courts have to follow it. So my concern is that if a Hong Kong judge does interpret vague language in one of the new offenses so as to comply with the ICCPR and the Hong Kong Basic Law, there is a risk that the NPC Standing Committee could issue an overriding interpretation. So at this stage, we don't really know what's going to happen with the vague language. And some of the language in these offenses isn't so vague. Some of the language, I think, just overtly violates international human rights law. And then the third area of concern are the new enforcement powers. Even the Hong Kong police now have great enforcement powers that they did not have before. There's a new branch, the special branch, or they're calling it in the press the N branch of the Hong Kong police. And under Article 43 of the new law, they have extensive enforcement powers. The new Committee for Safeguarding National Security, which has a lot of Hong Kong officials, but also mainland Chinese representation, has the power to issue implementation rules for these new powers. It has already done so very quickly. There are implementation rules that will allow extraordinary searches without a court warrant, and that will allow covert surveillance without judicial approval. That's a big change in Hong Kong. So the enforcement powers are much stronger than under previous Hong Kong law with far fewer safeguards. And once again, the decisions of this Committee for Safeguarding National Security are, according to the law, not subject to judicial review. Now, one of my former colleagues at the University of Hong Kong, Professor Albert Chen, who is on the Committee for the Basic Law, he has argued that even with that not subject to judicial review language, he thinks that the Hong Kong court should be able to strike down actions if this committee exceeds its powers. I'm honestly not sure if he's right about that. He may be overly optimistic. But even if they stay within their powers are pretty vast. So in a nutshell, I think the separate criminal justice system that was promised to Hong Kong under the Sino-British Joint Declaration really has been greatly damaged by this new law.
Wow. Yeah.
That's a lot, I know.
Yeah, and it sounds like, I mean, we're still learning about it. It's a work in progress almost daily, and we don't know where it's going, although I can see you have some concerns about the intent or the purpose of it, and the broad language that it gives to define and enforce, well, to define what's wrong and to enforce law, to enforce action. Now, you know, I think, you know, from my perspective, that this law seems to be a reaction to some of the protests that happened, democracy protests that happened in Hong Kong quite recently. I'm not sure if I'm right on that. I'd like your input. And then I also understand that, you know, the PRC, the People's Republic of China, at one point said that Hong Kong is playing with fire. And so my question is, if that's true, if Hong Kong is playing with fire, or is this new law, is it going to extinguish that fire, or is it going to throw fuel on the fire? What do you, I mean, can you tell right now, or are we still waiting to see? So I guess, is this law a reaction? And have you seen what is it a reaction to the democracy protests? And have you seen what further reaction there might be yet?
Yes. In fact, I think we recorded a program, you and I, last August with that title, is Hong Kong Playing with Fire. And right. I certainly agree with you. This is very much a reaction to the protests of 2019. To go back to the summer of 2019, what the Hong Kong people were initially protesting against was a bill that had been introduced by the chief executive's government, which is appointed by Beijing, that could have allowed case-by-case extradition of a fugitive from Hong Kong to mainland China and other parts of the world for trial. Prior to that, there was no way to legally extradite someone from Hong Kong to mainland China. And that was a sign of that legal firewall, right? It's very unusual not to have to be able to extradite someone from one part of a country to another. But because there was so little confidence in the right to fair trial in mainland China, Hong Kong's Legislative Council had decided not to have an extradition agreement with the mainland. The chief executive was trying to get around that with a bill that would have allowed what she called case-by-case extradition. The people went out in force to march against it. And at one point, it was estimated that as many as 2 million people of Hong Kong, out of a population of a little over 7 million, were in the streets, peacefully protesting, at least initially. Unfortunately, the protests didn't all stay peaceful. And that is partly because I think Carrie Lam's government, or perhaps under the direction of Beijing, made a strategic mistake. They should have withdrawn the bill right away. They didn't. No, even when 2 million people were in the streets, they did not withdraw the bill. They waited until there was some violence. There was some vandalism, there was some violent clashes with the police by a very small percentage of the population. And then after that, she withdrew the bill. And I always said that's a big mistake. And in fact, there were students who were putting up signs that said, "You taught us that peaceful protest doesn't work. What works is we finally had to start breaking some things." And that was very unusual in Hong Kong, which has always had a tradition of peaceful protests. And so the protests started, instead of dampening down, they started to escalate. And the people started making more demands. They started putting up 5 fingers. And the 5 fingers were not just for the withdrawal of the bill, but for other things like, let's go back and talk about the democracy reforms that we were supposed to have, but which have not been given to us. We want Carrie Lam to step down. We want an independent investigation on police violence, because they felt that the police were deliberately using pepper spray and other tools of control in a violent manner. And so what happened is the conflict escalated. The people started demanding more, and in some cases, there were some very violent clashes. I was actually on the University of Hong Kong's campus in November 2019. I was supposed to be there to observe classes as an external examiner. And instead, I wound up just walking around campus talking to the students, because the students had barricaded the campus and classes were canceled. And Hong Kong U, our former campus, stayed peaceful. It really did. The police never really intervened, but the police did intervene in other campuses, and there were some very violent clashes. So I think it's fair to say that from Beijing's point of view, in the late fall of 2019, Hong Kong was in a state of turmoil. And they kept waiting for the Hong Kong government to get it under control. And the Hong Kong government just started ordering the police to use more and more repressive measures rather than negotiating with the people. And so this conflict has escalated. So yes, probably Hong Kong was playing with fire. I always tried to urge peaceful mechanisms, and so did a lot of other politicians in Hong Kong. But it's difficult to control a movement like that because there is no actual coordinated movement. It's very much a decentralized pro-democracy movement. And so it's hard to ensure that everybody restrains themselves to peaceful measures.
And I want to we'll take a break right now. And then when we come back, I'd like to ask you what you have seen to be the reaction of those students and the pro-democracy folks. So we'll take a short break. Be right back, and then I'd like to see what what you've seen.
Aloha, I'm Christine Linders, a physical therapy specialist and the host of Movement Matters. My show is designed to teach you the simplest and most effective treatment strategies to get you out of pain and back to doing what you love. If you or someone you know is having pain in a certain area of the body and would like a free assessment and treatment over media or in person, and then come on the show to talk about it, email us at thinktechmovementmatters@gmail.com. Or if you have a topic you would like to know more about, please email us. My goal is to decrease pain all over the world, inspiring people to take better care of their bodies to enjoy life to the fullest. I look forward to hearing from you.
Aloha, we are back with Carole Petersen talking about the new national security law and Hong Kong. And Carole, when we left, I want to ask you, we talked about playing with fire, and we talked about that maybe is this going to extinguish fire, or is this going to throw more fuel on it? What have you seen so far in the month? And do you have any thoughts about what the future holds?
Well, there's no question that a great many people in Hong Kong are changing their behavior with respect to what they say. So right away, as soon as the law went into force, the Hong Kong police started putting up purple banners saying you may be in violation of the national security law. And what they were referring to is this very popular protest slogan that translate in English, it translates to liberate Hong Kong, revolution of our times. And some people have said that it's just a call for liberating Hong Kong from oppression and allowing Hong Kong to develop a democratic system as an autonomous region of China. Other people say, no, what it means is it's a call for independence. And under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, people should be able to advocate peacefully for constitutional change and even for independence. In Hawaii, there are people who advocate for independence for Hawaii all the time, right? It's not a crime. Right. But under this law, the definition of secession is so broad that the government is telling people that you are in violation of that law if you merely display this banner when you're walking in a peaceful protest, right? So how are the people of Hong Kong reacting? Well, there are some people who are probably still going to display that banner and they may get arrested, but a great many people in Hong Kong, being resilient and creative, are simply putting up blank pieces of paper. And I understand that some of the students on campuses where they have these Lenin walls, they are now putting up blank pieces of paper. And everyone knows what they mean, but they're not violating the law. So that's an example of resilience, I would say. Another example of changed behavior is a whole lot of local pro-democracy politicians have publicly announced that they will be very careful to no longer go overseas and meet with foreign politicians. They will never, ever, ever suggest that there be any sanctions against China or the Hong Kong government. Why are they doing this? Well, partly because it could be a criminal offense under the definition of collusion with foreign powers, but also because many of them want to run in the September 2020 Legislative Council elections. And you may know that last fall, the pro-democracy parties did extremely well in the district council elections. They trounced the pro-Beijing parties. And so Beijing and the local government are very worried that the pro-democracy politicians are going to win a majority in the Legislative Council in September. So what many people suspect is that the local government is going to try to use this law to disqualify many of the pro-democracy candidates from running for office. So they are now trying very carefully to say, don't worry, I support the basic law and I will certainly not violate the national security law. I will never seek sanctions on China. And I don't think they will. I mean, they're not lying, they're being honest. The question is, will it be enough? Because I think some of these local politicians are already being grilled by the local election authority in a clear effort, I believe, to try to disqualify them. So then the third thing I'm really noticing, and I think this is very positive, is that local lawyers and academics in Hong Kong are really trying very hard to have educational seminars about the law to try to suggest the most progressive and rights protecting interpretations of the law that are possible. And a number of my former colleagues at the University of Hong Kong have been involved in these seminars. And you can actually listen to them if you go on to the University of Hong Kong Faculty of Law's website. They have recorded Zoom conferences like this one, and you can hear different interpretations of the law and suggestions for how we might be able to mitigate the bad effects. I'm going to participate on August 8th in a seminar that the University of Hong Kong is organizing on academic freedom and this law, because that's one of the great concerns we have. In theory, to me, if someone simply writes an academic article discussing, say, whether this law violates the ICCPR, or criticizing China's human rights records, or discussing whether Tibet has a right to self-determination, that should not be a violation of this law. But the universities are really going to have to grapple with this because they don't want to be accused of violating the national security law.
Right, and it looks like it's something that we're going to wait and see too. It sounds like this law is kind of being interpreted on the run. And I mean, what are the people in the businesses in Hong Kong doing? I mean, are people thinking of leaving, and where will they go, and what are the options available?
Well,
I mean, you know, it seems a little scary if I was a citizen of Hong Kong, and even if I was just in Hong Kong talking at a seminar, it sounds
right.
a little frightening. What are the options?
For the average working person in Hong Kong, if you're not involved in politics and you're not involved in the anti-extradition and pro-democracy movements, it might not affect your daily life that much. But if you are someone involved in the pro-democracy movement, or you teach law, or you teach politics, or you're a student activist, this law has great repercussions. Quite a few people have already left Hong Kong. For example, Nathan Law, who was one of the people who did testify before the US House of Representatives about the law, he tweeted shortly after giving that testimony that he was on a plane and he left Hong Kong. So some people have left. The United Kingdom has announced that anyone with the BNO, British National Overseas Passport, which quite a few people in Hong Kong have, they will be welcome to come to the UK. A number of other countries, like the United States and Australia, will probably be very favorable toward people who are seeking political asylum. But let's face it, it's going to be a small percentage of people who really feel that they have the economic ability to make a life overseas. So the vast majority of people are probably going to stay in Hong Kong simply because they cannot see how they'd be able to support themselves and adjust to a new life far, far away from Hong Kong, and because they love Hong Kong. Now, for foreign businesses, that's a different issue. One of the points I've made in my article is that this law has extraterritorial effect. And so under Article 38 and 37 and 36, foreign citizens, even those who are not permanent residents of Hong Kong, could be prosecuted under this law if they, find themselves passing through Hong Kong or China and they are arrested. So for example, it would be an offense for you to lobby Congress to put sanctions on either Hong Kong or China. It's a criminal offense now. And if your lobbying is successful and the effects of those sanctions are felt in Hong Kong, if you're a permanent resident of Hong Kong, even if your lobbying is not successful and therefore there's no effects in Hong Kong, it's still a criminal offense even to ask the Congress to issue sanctions, which was one of the reasons I was very careful not to ask for sanctions when I testified before the Congressional Committee. More recently, we have seen some people questioning whether even if you ask the United Nations Human Rights Council to debate a motion on human rights in China, could that be a hostile activity against China? I don't think so. In my opinion, that should not fall under the definition of collusion. But as you said, there's a great deal of uncertainty. And so it's very possible that some foreign businesses might just say, I think we're going to relocate to somewhere like Korea or Japan or Singapore and make our Asian hub there because our employees will feel safer living there. There's also the question of what is a state secret? Because one of the things that can get you into trouble under this law is if you are accused of giving state secrets to a foreign government or even to any institution or individual outside of Hong Kong and China. Unfortunately, the law doesn't actually define what a state secret is. And there is a provision in the law that says that if the court is given a certificate by Hong Kong's chief executive that something is a state secret, then the court has to follow that. And we all know that mainland China has a very broad definition of state secret. It can even be financial information. So there's a lot of concern about safety in Hong Kong now.
And that, you know, in the 1 minute we have left in our program, you know, why is China doing this? I mean, I love Hong Kong. It's a great place, different, you know, I like to go to China too, but Hong Kong was an interesting place economically and people-wise, and it had its own personality, and it was a kind of a gateway for the rest of the world to China in some ways. Why is China doing this, do you think?
Well, in a word, I think that the central government decided that all the advantages you speak of, including Hong Kong's special status for the purposes of controlled exports, did not outweigh their fear that things were getting out of control in Hong Kong. And the central government is very firm about not wanting protests to get out of control. And they put down protests in Guangdong province, right? Mm-hmm. And the person who put down those protests is now in charge of the new Office of Safeguarding National Security in Hong Kong.
Oh, I see. Well, Carole, this is very interesting. I think this is probably a continuing conversation. I appreciate your expertise and knowledge and your thoughts, and hopefully things will get better. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Aloha.